Jake Miller wiped the sweat from his forehead as he drove his old truck across the Nevada desert, and the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything orange and red, and he had been searching for salvage all day with nothing to show for it except dust and disappointment. He was about to turn back when his scanner started beeping in a pattern he had never heard before, and the sound was urgent, almost panicked, and Jake frowned as he checked the display because the readings made no sense at all. The radiation levels were jumping up and down like a heartbeat, and the metal signature was unlike anything in his database. And whatever was out there was big, and it was fresh, because the sand around it was still smoking. Jake turned his truck toward the signal and drove faster than was safe across the rough terrain, because curiosity had always been his weakness and his strength, and after 20 minutes he saw it. A crater stretched across the desert floor at least 200 feet wide, and at the center was something that took his breath away. The ship was beautiful in a way that made his chest hurt, because it was shaped like a teardrop made of silver metal that seemed to flow like liquid, and symbols glowed along its surface in colors that shifted between blue and green and purple, and the whole thing hummed with power that made the air vibrate. Jake stopped his truck at the edge of the crater and sat there for a long moment just staring, because this was not a satellite, and this was not human technology, and this was something that would change everything. He grabbed his toolkit and his scanner and climbed out of the truck, and the evening air was cool against his skin as he made his way down into the crater, and every step felt important, like he was walking into history. The ship was even more impressive up close, and Jake could see now that it was damaged because there were cracks in the hull that leaked strange golden fluid and scorch marks that suggested it had been in a fight before it crashed. He walked around it slowly, taking readings and photographs because nobody would believe this without proof, and his hands were shaking with excitement and fear and wonder, all mixed together. "Hello," Jake said. And he felt foolish immediately, because why would an alien ship understand English or care about a lone salvage hunter in the middle of nowhere? But then the ship answered. "Systems online," came a voice directly into his mind, not through his ears but deeper somehow, like it was speaking to his soul, and Jake stumbled backward and nearly fell. Because this was real, this was actually happening. "Who are you?" Jake managed to ask, and his voice came out as a whisper because his throat was tight with emotion. "I am Sanctuary Vessel of House Silverwing, and you are the first to speak the ancient tongue in 3,000 cycles," the voice replied. And Jake wanted to laugh because he was just speaking English. Plain, ordinary English. "What ancient tongue?" Jake asked as blue light erupted from the hull and wrapped around him like gentle hands, and he should have been terrified. But instead he felt safe somehow. Protected. "The language of makers," the ship said. And suddenly images flooded Jake's mind faster than he could process them. He saw vast cities floating among the stars and beings that looked almost human, except for their pointed ears and eyes that held entire galaxies, and he saw creatures with wings that breathed fire and frost and fought in battles that shook planets' dragons. Jake whispered because that was the only word that fit, and the images faded, leaving him dizzy and amazed. Yes, the dragons of House Silverwing bonded to the elven high families for 10,000 generations, the ship explained, and its voice held sadness like an old wound that never healed. Jake steadied himself against the ship's hull, and the metal was warm under his palm like living skin, and he could feel a pulse beneath the surface, slow and steady, like a sleeping heart. "Why can I understand you?" Jake asked, because none of this made sense, and he was just a human. Just a salvage hunter with no special gifts or abilities, because you carry the Maker's gift in your blood, diluted across countless generations, but present nonetheless, the ship replied. And Jake felt something shift inside him like a door opening that he never knew existed. "What makers?" Jake asked, and he was afraid of the answer. But he needed to know. "Your ancestors, the ones who walked among stars before humanity forgot its origins. The ones who built ships that thought and loved and dreamed," the ship said. And Jake sat down hard in the sand because his legs would not hold him anymore. "That's impossible," Jake said. But even as he spoke, he knew it was true, because how else could he understand this voice? How else could he see those images? "Nothing is impossible for makers," the ship replied. And there was something like affection in its tone, and the blue light brightened around Jake like it was happy to have found him. "Is there anyone else on the ship?" Jake asked. because suddenly he realized that a ship this size would need a crew lady. Amber Silverwing rests in stasis awaiting one who could wake the ship and speak the words of power, the ship said, and Jake's heart began to race again. Can I see her? Jake asked, standing up, because he had to know who this person was, who had slept in the desert while humanity grew and changed. The ship hummed, and a doorway opened in its side, revealing stairs that descended into depths that should not fit inside the hull, and soft light glowed from below. Inviting and warm. Enter, Maker, and see what you have found, the ship said. Jake took a deep breath and looked back, at his truck sitting at the edge of the crater and at the desert beyond, where his old life waited, and he knew that if he walked through that door, nothing would ever be the same. But some choices made themselves, and Jake had always been curious, and he had always wondered if there was more to life than scraping by in the wasteland searching for scrap. He walked through the doorway, and the stairs lit up beneath his feet, in patterns that looked like constellations, and the air smelled like ozone and something sweet like flowers he had no name for. The interior was vast and beautiful, with corridors that curved in impossible directions, and walls that seemed to be made of crystal and light. And Jake walked deeper into the ship, following the gentle pull of that voice in his mind. He passed rooms filled with equipment he did not recognize, and chambers that held objects of such beauty that he wanted to stop and stare. But the ship urged him forward, gently insistent. Finally he entered a large chamber at the heart of the vessel, and his breath caught in his throat. Crystal pods lined the walls like sleeping giants, and they glowed with soft blue light, and inside each pod was a dragon. They were magnificent, even in sleep, with scales that shimmered in colors that shifted and changed, and wings folded against their sides, and Jake could see the intelligence in their faces, even with their eyes closed. But it was the center pod that drew his attention, because inside it lay a woman. She was beautiful in a way that made Jake forget how to breathe, because her features were too perfect, too refined, and her hair was the color of autumn leaves mixed with threads of actual gold. And even in sleep, her face held authority and grace. Her ears came to delicate points, and her skin seemed to glow with inner light, and she wore armor that looked like it was made from dragon scales and starlight. Lady Amber Silverwing, the ship said with reverence that made the air feel heavy. The last Dragon Queen. How long has she been here? Jake asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. 3,472 of your years, the ship replied, and Jake felt the weight of all that time pressing down on him, because empires rose and fell in less time. Can she be saved? Jake asked, because looking at her sleeping face, he knew he would try no matter what it cost. If you repair my core systems, yes, the ship said. But I must warn you, Maker, once she wakes, the galaxy will know. Jake looked at the sleeping queen and at the dragons around her, and at his own hands that had never done anything more important than fix broken equipment, and he made his choice. Tell me what you need, Jake said, and the ship sang with joy that echoed through every corridor. The ship showed Jake holographic displays of its damaged systems, and the images floated in the air like living things, and Jake studied them carefully, trying to understand what he was looking at. My core matrix is fractured from the crash, the ship explained, and without it I cannot maintain Lady Amber's stasis pod or wake the dragons, and I need rare materials to repair the damage. What materials? Jake asked, and he pulled out his tablet to take notes, because his memory was good but not perfect. The ship listed several elements and compounds, and Jake recognized some of them from his salvage work, and others were complete mysteries, but he wrote everything down carefully. I can get most of these from the mining stations, Jake said, but some of them will be expensive, and I don't have much money. The ship was quiet for a moment, and then light flowed across the walls, and a panel opened, revealing a small compartment, and inside were crystals that glowed with inner fire. These are power crystals from my emergency reserves, the ship said. Take one to the surface cities and trade it for what you need. But be careful, because there are those who would kill for such things. Jake picked up one crystal, and it was warm in his hand, and lighter than it should be, and it pulsed gently like a living heart, and he tucked it carefully into his jacket pocket. How long does Lady Amber have? Jake asked, because he needed to know how much time he had. 3 weeks, perhaps 4, before the stasis field fails completely. The ship replied, and its voice held worry that made Jake move faster. "It'll start tomorrow," Jake promised, and he took one last look at the sleeping queen before heading back through the quarry. Doors toward the exit. "Wait," the ship called, and Jake stopped and turned back. "You should know what you are agreeing to, Maker," the ship said, and its tone was serious in a way that made Jake pay close attention. "Tell me," Jake said, because he deserved to know what he was getting into. "Lady Amber is not just any noble. She was the Dragon Queen, the one who led our people in the final war against the Void Eaters." The ship explained, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine at those words. "What are Void Eaters?" Jake asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know. "Creatures from the dark spaces between stars that consume life itself," the ship said. "And Lady Amber fought them for 100 years before she realized her people were fading and rather than watch them die. She chose to sleep, hoping that one day the Makers would return." "And if I wake her?" Jake asked, because the implications were huge and terrifying. "Then you prove that the Makers have returned, and the scattered elven houses will hear. The call in the galaxy will tremble because some oaths transcend time itself." The ship replied. Jake stood there in the glowing corridor and thought about his simple life as a salvage hunter, and about the woman sleeping in her crystal pod, and about the choice that stood before him. "He'll be back tomorrow," Jake said finally, because some things were more important than safety or comfort. The ship let him go, and Jake climbed back up the stairs and out into the desert night, and the stars were brighter than he had ever seen them, and he wondered how many of them held life and how many knew about the sleeping queen. He drove back to his trailer on the edge of the nearest town, and he did not sleep that night because his mind was too full of images and possibilities. The next morning, Jake cleaned himself up and put on his best clothes and drove 3 hours to Carson City, where the big trading posts operated and where questions were rarely asked if you had money. The power crystal drew attention. The moment he showed it to the first dealer, and the woman behind the counter went pale when she scanned it. "Where did you get this?" she asked, and her voice shook slightly. "Found it," Jake said simply because the truth would sound insane. The woman offered him 50,000 credits, and Jake knew it was worth 10 times that, but he did not have time to negotiate, and he needed the money now. "Deal," Jake said, and he left with a credit chip that held more money than he had earned in 5 years of salvage. Work. He spent the next 2 days buying everything on the ship's list, and some items required bribes to obtain, because they were restricted materials. But Jake paid without complaint. On the 3rd day, he drove back to the crater with his truck loaded, down with crates and containers, and the ship welcomed him like a lost friend. "You have done well, Maker," the ship said, and its voice held approval that made Jake feel warm. "Just call me Jake," he replied, as he began carrying the materials down into the ship, and the work ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. The ship guided him through the repair process, and Jake's hands seemed to know what to do, even when his mind did not understand, and it was like the knowledge was buried deep in his genes, waiting to be awakened. He worked for hours connecting systems and sealing fractures and replacing damaged components, and the ship sang softly as it felt itself healing. "Tell me about her," Jake said as he worked, because he wanted to know more about the woman he was trying to save. "Lady Amber was born to a minor house," the ship began, and its voice took on the tone of someone sharing a beloved story. "She was not supposed to be queen, but when the Void Eaters came, and the old king fell in battle, she was the one who rallied the scattered fleets, and she was the one who bonded with 7 dragons instead of the traditional one." "7," Jake said, pausing in his work, because that sounded impossible. "Yes, 7," the ship confirmed, and each one gave her a gift, and together, they became something greater than any had been alone. "What happened to them?" Jake asked, looking toward the crystal pods that held the sleeping dragons. "They sleep with her, waiting for a Maker to call them back to service," the ship said, "and they dream of the stars and of battles yet to come." Jake returned to his work, and the hours passed like minutes, and finally, as the sun was setting again, the ship blazed with light. "Core systems restored," the ship announced, and its voice rang with joy and triumph. Jake sat down hard on the floor because he was exhausted and his hands were shaking from the delicate work, but he felt satisfied in a way he had never experienced. "Can you wake her now?" Jake asked. "Not yet," the ship said. "I need time to rebuild my power reserves, and you need rest, Maker." Jake nodded, and he made his way back to the surface and to his truck. and he drove home through the dark desert and slept for 12 hours straight. When he woke the next morning, there was a message on his tablet from an unknown source. The message was simple, but it made his blood run cold. "We know what you found," it said, "and we are coming." Jake grabbed his jacket and ran for his truck because whoever had sent that message meant trouble, and he had to warn the ship and protect Lady Amber. He drove faster than he ever had before, racing across the desert as the sun climbed higher, and his scanner was beeping frantically because there were other vehicles approaching the crater from different directions. Jake reached the crater first, but barely, and he could see dust clouds in the distance marking the approach of others. He ran down into the crater and pressed his hand against the ship's hull. "We have company," Jake said urgently. "I know," the ship replied, and its voice held worry. "Can you defend yourself?" Jake asked. "Not yet. My weapon systems are still offline," the ship said. "Then we need to get Lady Amber and the dragons out of here," Jake said, because staying felt like suicide. "Cannot move her pod without risking her life," the ship said, "and we do not have the power to leave this planet." Jake looked back at the approaching vehicles and made a decision. "Then I'll have to stop them," Jake said, and he did not know how. But he knew. He had to try. "Wait," the ship said, and another panel opened, revealing a weapon that looked both ancient and deadly. "Take this," the ship said, and Jake picked up the weapon, and it felt right in his hands like it was made for him. "What is it?" Jake asked. "A maker's tool," the ship replied, "and it will answer to your will." The first vehicle reached the crater edge, and armed men began climbing down, and Jake stood at the entrance to the ship with the weapon in his hands and determination in his heart. He did not know if he could stop them, but he knew he had to try because some things were worth fighting for, and a sleeping queen and her dragons were definitely among them. The men came down the crater slope with military precision, and Jake counted 12, of them all armed with rifles and wearing body armor that looked expensive and serious. The leader was a tall man with gray hair and cold eyes, and he stopped about 20 feet from Jake and raised his hand to signal his men to halt. "You must be Jake Miller," he said, and his voice was calm and professional, like they were discussing the weather instead of standing in front of an alien spacecraft. "Who are you?" Jake asked, and he kept the weapon pointed at the ground but ready to raise it if needed. "Name is Colonel Richard Hayes," the man said, "and I work for a private security firm that specializes in unusual acquisitions." "You mean you steal things?" Jake said flatly. "We prefer to think of it as protecting important discoveries from falling into the wrong hands," the colonel replied with a thin smile. "And you think your hands are the right ones?" Jake asked. "More right than a salvage hunter who doesn't understand what he has found," the colonel said, and his eyes moved past Jake to look at the ship, and Jake saw greed and fear mixed together in that gaze. "I understand enough," Jake said. "Do you?" the colonel asked. "Because that ship represents technology centuries beyond anything humanity has, and in the wrong hands, it could destabilize the entire solar system." "And in your hands," Jake said, letting sarcasm drip from his words, "it would be studied and protected and used to benefit all of humanity," the colonel replied. But Jake could hear the lie beneath the smooth words. Jake looked at the men surrounding him and at their weapons, and he knew he could not win a fight against trained soldiers, but he also knew he could not let them take the ship. "The ship belongs to Lady Amber Silverwing," Jake said, "and she will decide what happens to it when she wakes." The colonel laughed, and it was not a kind sound. "There is no one inside that ship except you, son, and whatever fairy tales it has been telling you." Jake felt anger rise in his chest, hot and fierce. "She is real," Jake said, "and she has been sleeping for over 3,000 years waiting for someone who could wake the ship." The colonel shook his head sadly, like Jake was a child who believed in monsters under the bed. "Step aside, son," the colonel said, and his hand moved toward his sidearm. "And this doesn't have to get ugly." Jake raised the weapon, and it hummed to life in his hands, and blue energy crackled along its length, and suddenly it did not feel like he was holding a tool, but rather like the tool was holding him. The colonel's men brought their rifles up instantly, and 12 red dots appeared on Jake's chest. "Last chance, son," the colonel said. Jake felt the weapon teaching him, showing him how to use it through some connection he did not understand, and he knew that if he fired, it would cut through their armor like paper. But he also knew that killing was not the answer, because violence would only prove the colonel's point about wrong hands. The ship spoke in Jake's mind, urgent and worried. There is another way, Maker, but you must trust me. What way? Jake thought back, and his finger was tight on the weapon trigger. Wake me, the ship said. The men came down the crater slope with military precision, and Jake counted 12 of them, all armed with rifles and wearing body armor that looked expensive and serious. The leader was a tall man with gray hair and cold eyes, and he stopped about 20 feet from Jake and raised his hand to signal his men to halt. You must be Jake Miller, he said, and his voice was calm and professional, like they were discussing the weather instead of standing in front of an alien spacecraft. Who are you, Jake? Asked, and he kept the weapon pointed at the ground but ready to raise it if needed. My name is Colonel Richard Hayes, the man said, and I work for a private security firm that specializes in unusual acquisitions. You mean you steal things? Jake said, flatly. We prefer to think of it as protecting important discoveries from falling into the wrong hands. The colonel replied with a thin smile. And you think your hands are the right ones? Jake asked, more right than a salvage hunter who doesn't understand what he has found, the colonel said, and his eyes moved past Jake to look at the ship, and Jake saw greed and fear mixed together in that gaze. I understand enough, Jake said. Do you? The colonel asked, because that ship represents technology centuries beyond anything humanity has, and in the wrong hands it could destabilize the entire solar system. And in your hands, Jake said, letting sarcasm drip from his words, it would be studied and protected and used to benefit all of humanity, the colonel replied. But Jake could hear the lie beneath the smooth words. Jake looked at the men surrounding him and at their weapons, and he knew he could not win a fight against trained soldiers. But he also knew he could not let them take the ship. The ship belongs to Lady Amber Silverwing, Jake said, and she will decide what happens to it when she wakes. The colonel laughed, and it was not a kind sound. There is no one inside that ship except you, son, and whatever fairy tales it has been telling you. Jake felt anger, her eyes in his chest hot and fierce. She is real, Jake said, and she has been sleeping for over 3,000 years waiting for someone who could wake the ship. The colonel shook his head sadly, like Jake was a child who believed in monsters under the bed. Step aside, son, the colonel said, and his hand moved toward his sidearm. And this doesn't have to get ugly. Jake raised the weapon, and it hummed to life in his hands, and blue energy crackled along its length, and suddenly it did not feel like he was holding a tool, but rather like the tool was holding him. The colonel's men brought their rifles up instantly, and 12 red dots appeared on Jake's chest. Last chance, son, the colonel said. Jake felt the weapon teaching him, showing him how to use it through some connection he did not understand, and he knew that if he fired it would cut through their armor like paper. But he also knew that killing was not the answer, because violence would only prove the colonel's point about wrong hands. The ship spoke in Jake's mind, urgent and worried. There is another way, Maker, but you must trust me. What way? Jake thought back, and his finger was tight on the weapon trigger. Wake me, the ship said. You said you needed more time. Jake replied, I have enough power for a few minutes, and that may be all we need. The ship explained. Do it, Jake said, and he heard the colonel shouting orders, and the men advancing. Light exploded from the ship behind Jake, bright enough to blind and hot enough to make everyone stumble backward, and the hull sang with power that made the air vibrate. The ship's exterior shifted and changed, and weapons ports opened, and targeting systems came online, and suddenly it went from looking like a crashed wreck to looking like a predator, ready to strike. Stand down the ships. Voice boomed out loud enough for everyone to hear, and Jake realized it was using external speakers. Colonel Hayes froze, and his men looked uncertain, and one of them lowered his rifle slightly. What the hell? The colonel whispered. This is Sanctuary Vessel of House Silverwing, the ship announced, and I am protected by ancient law, and any who harm my maker or attempt to board me without permission will be destroyed. The colonel laughed, but it sounded forced. Ancient law means nothing here. The colonel said, this is Earth, and Earth laws apply. Then let me educate you, the ship said. And suddenly, holographic images appeared in the air above the crater. The images showed battles in space and planets burning and great, fleets of ships fighting against creatures of shadow and nightmare. And through it all, a woman with autumn hair rode a golden dragon and fought with courage that made even the colonel step back. That is Lady Amber Silverwing, the ship said. The dragon, queen and the last of the Maker bloodlines until now. The images changed, showing Earth from space, but different, somehow younger. Your world was once an outpost of the Elven Empire. The ship explained a place where makers came to study and explore, and when the Great Silence came, some chose to stay and they forgot their origins, but the blood remained dormant, waiting. The colonel stared at the images, and Jake could see him trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed about reality. "This is impossible," the colonel said weakly. "Your species said the same thing about flight once," the ship replied, "and yet you mastered the stars in a few short centuries." One of the soldiers, a young woman with scared eyes, lowered her rifle completely. "Are you saying humans are descended from aliens?" she asked. "I am saying that humans are the children of makers." The ship corrected, "And Jake here carries the gift strong and pure enough to wake me and speak the ancient tongue." The colonel looked at Jake with new eyes, and Jake saw the calculation happening behind them. "If what you say is true," the colonel said, "then Jake is the most valuable person on this planet, and he needs protection." "Jake does not need your protection," the ship said. "And its weapons?" hummed louder. The colonel raised his hand slowly, carefully. "Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot," he said. "I am prepared to offer Jake a substantial amount of money for access to study the ship. The ship is not mine to sell," Jake said firmly. "Then what do you want?" the colonel asked, and his voice held genuine curiosity. "Now, I want to wake Lady Amber and let her decide what happens next," Jake said, "because she has earned that right." The colonel was quiet for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "Long until she wakes?" he asked. "Soon," Jake said. "Then I will wait," the colonel replied, and he signaled his men to lower their weapons and step back. "You will leave this crater," the ship commanded, "and you will not return unless invited." The colonel smiled thinly. "My men and I will camp at the crater edge," he said, close enough to respond if Jake needs help, but far enough to respect your boundaries. Jake did not trust the colonel, but he also knew that having armed men nearby might discourage others from trying to take the ship. "Fine," Jake said. The colonel nodded and led his men back up the crater slope, and Jake watched them go with tension singing through his muscles. "That was dangerous, Maker," the ship said quietly in Jake's mind. "I know," Jake replied, "but it bought us time." "Perhaps," the ship said, "and perhaps it has also revealed our presence to others who will be less reasonable." Jake turned back to look at the ship and at the entrance that led down to Lady Amber. "How long before you can wake her?" Jake asked. "With the core systems restored, I can attempt it tomorrow," the ship said. "But there are risks." "What kind of risks?" Jake asked, though. He was afraid of the answer. "She has been asleep for over 3 millennia, the ship explained, and her body and mind may not survive the shock of waking. But if we don't wake her," Jake said, "then she will die anyway within days," the ship finished. Jake nodded and made his decision. "Tomorrow then," he said. "And whatever happens, we tried," the ship hummed acknowledgement, and Jake sat down with his back against the hull and looked up at the stars appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there were worlds where elves still lived and dragons still flew and wars still raged. And tomorrow he might wake a queen who would bridge the gap between those distant stars and his small desert planet. Jake closed his eyes and tried to rest, because tomorrow everything would change. One way or another, in the morning the ship woke him gently, and Jake rose and stretched, and walked down into the heart of the vessel. The chamber with the crystal pods glowed brighter than before, and Lady Amber's pod hummed with energy. "Are you ready?" the ship asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jake said. "Then place your hand on the pod and speak. Her name," the ship instructed, "and the gift in your blood will do. The rest." Jake approached the pod slowly, and he could see Lady Amber's face so peaceful in sleep, and he wondered what dreams she had dreamed for 3,000 years. He placed his hand on the crystal, and it was warm and alive beneath his palm. "Lady Amber Silverwing," Jake said, and his voice echoed through the chamber. "Wake up, because the makers have returned." The crystal pod hummed louder, and light flowed through channels that Jake had not noticed before, and the whole chamber began to glow like the inside of a star. Lady Amber's eyes opened, and they were the color of molten gold, and for a moment she looked confused and lost, like someone waking from a dream they could not remember. Then her gaze focused on Jake, and recognition flashed across her face, followed by wonder. "You came," she whispered, and her voice was musical, Like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, the crystal dissolved around her, turning to mist that faded into nothing, and she sat up slowly, gracefully, and Jake stepped back to give her space. "My name is Jake Miller," he said, "and I found your ship crashed in the desert." "I know who you are," the Queen said. And she stood, and she was tall, taller than Jake by several inches, and her presence filled the room like sunlight. "How do you know me?" Jake asked. "Because Sanctuary told me while I woke," she replied. "And because I can see the Maker's gift, burning in your soul, bright and pure." Jake did not know what to say to that, so he stayed quiet and watched as she looked around the chamber, and her expression shifted from joy to sadness. "How long?" she asked, and her voice broke slightly. 3,472 years, Jake said gently. The Queen closed her eyes, and Jake saw tears slip down her cheeks, and when she opened her eyes again, they held grief that made Jake's heart ache. "My people," she said. "Some survived," the ship said, speaking aloud, and they scattered across the galaxy, preserving what they could, but they forgot the old ways. Lady Amber said it was not a question. "Yes," the ship confirmed. The Queen took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, and Jake saw her set aside, her grief like taking off a heavy cloak. "Then we must help them remember," she said. And she looked at Jake with determination that made him believe she could do anything. "There is something you should know," Jake said, and he told her about Colonel Hayes and his men waiting at the crater edge. The Queen listened carefully, and when Jake finished, she nodded slowly. "Humans have advanced far in my absence," she observed. "We have," Jake agreed, "but we still have a long way to go." She smiled, and it was warm, and genuine humanity always did have potential, she said. "And your ancestors were among the finest makers." "My ancestors?" Jake asked, because he still struggled to believe what the ship had told him. "Yes," the Queen said, and she placed her hand on Jake's shoulder, and warmth flowed from her touch, "and you carry their legacy in every cell." "What does that mean exactly?" Jake asked. "It means you can do things others cannot," she explained. "Speak to ships, bond with dragons, see the patterns that connect all living things." Wanted to ask more, but movement caught his eye, and he turned to see the dragon pods beginning to open. The dragons woke slowly, stretching wings that had been folded for millennia, and their scales shimmered in colors that had no names, and their eyes held intelligence that was almost frightening. The largest dragon, a magnificent creature with scales like molten gold, climbed out of its pod and moved toward Lady Amber, and the reunion was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. "Sundancer, the Eao," Queen said, and she pressed her forehead against the dragon's snout. "Little flame," the dragon replied, and its voice was deep and resonant and filled with love. The other 6 dragons emerged and gathered around their queen, and Jake felt like he was intruding on something sacred. Lady Amber turned to Jake and gestured for him to approach. "Do not be afraid," she said, "and Sundancer wishes to meet you." Jake walked forward slowly, and the golden dragon lowered its great head and looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through him. "You are the one who woke my rider," the dragon said. "I helped," Jake replied, "because it seemed important to be honest." "You did more than help," Sundancer said, "and you called across the void with a voice that has not been heard in ages." Jake reached out tentatively and touched the dragon's snout, and the scales were warm and smooth like polished stone. Suddenly images flooded Jake's mind, and he saw the world through dragon eyes, and felt the joy of flight and the fierce love of the bond between dragon and rider. Then something clicked into place in Jake's soul, and he gasped as power rushed through him. "The bond is made," Lady Amber said with wonder in her voice. "And Sundancer has chosen you." What Jake said because he could not have heard. "That right, dragons choose their riders," the Queen explained, "and Sundancer has chosen you as his second bond." "Can dragons do that?" Jake asked, and he could still feel the connection humming in his chest like a second heartbeat. "Only the most powerful ones," Lady Amber said, "and only when they find someone worthy." Jake looked at Sundancer, and the dragon looked back with what could only be described as satisfaction. "We will fly together," the dragon said, "and I will teach you what it means to be a makers." Ere before Jake could respond, the ship spoke urgently, warning multiple aircraft approaching fast. Lady Amber moved to the wall, and it became transparent, showing the sky above, and Jake saw military helicopters coming from 3 different directions. How many? The Queen asked. 15 aircraft, the ship reported, and ground vehicles approaching as well. Jake cursed under his breath and looked at the Queen. Colonel Hayes must have called for backup, he said. Then we must leave, Lady Amber decided. The ship cannot fly yet, Jake said. No sanctuary confirmed, but Lady Amber and the dragons can. The Queen nodded and turned to her dragons. We fly to safety, she commanded, and once we are secure, we will return for sanctuary. Where will you go? Jake asked. There is a place, she said, and her eyes grew distant with memory, where the old empire maintained a hidden outpost, and it should still be there. What about Jake? One of the smaller dragons asked a silver female with purple highlights. He comes with us, Lady Amber said, and Sundancer will carry him. Jake wanted to argue that he should stay and protect the ship, but the Queen gave him a look that said she would not debate this. Sanctuary will seal itself, the Queen said, and with the core systems restored, it can defend against anything these humans have. The ship hummed agreement. Go, Maker, it said, and return when it is safe. Lady Amber led the way up through the corridors, and Jake followed with his heart pounding, because he was about to fly on a dragon, and that was something he had never imagined doing. They emerged onto the ship's hull, and the morning sun was bright overhead, and Jake could see the helicopters getting closer. The dragons spread their wings, and Lady Amber mounted Sundancer with practiced ease, and she reached down to help Jake climb up behind her. Hold tight, she said, and trust Sundancer. Jake wrapped his arms around her waist and tried not to think about how high they were about to go. The dragon launched into the sky with a powerful leap, and Jake felt his stomach drop as they climbed, and the wind tore at his clothes. The other 6 dragons followed, and they formed a pattern around Sundancer, and Jake looked down to see the crater shrinking below them. The helicopters changed course to intercept, but the dragons were faster and more agile, and they climbed higher until the air grew thin and cold. Lady Amber laughed with pure joy, and Jake understood, because this was freedom in its purest form. They flew for hours, heading north and west, and the landscape changed beneath them from desert to mountains to forest, and Jake saw beauty he had never noticed from the ground. Finally, Lady Amber pointed ahead, and Jake saw what looked like a mountain, but something about it was wrong. That is our destination, she said, and the old outpost hidden in plain sight. As they approached, Jake realized the mountain was artificial, covered in centuries of growth, but underneath was structure and purpose. The dragons landed on a plateau near the summit, and Lady Amber slid down gracefully and helped Jake dismount. His legs were shaky and his arms ached from holding on, but he had never felt more alive. Welcome to Skyhold, she said, and the last refuge of House Silverwing. The mountain opened, and ancient doors that had been hidden by vegetation slid aside, revealing passages lit by soft blue light. Inside, Jake found wonders that took his breath away. Rooms filled with artifacts and technology, and knowledge preserved across millennia. But what caught his attention was the communication array sitting dormant in the central chamber. Lady Amber saw where he was looking and smiled. Yes, she said, and with this we can contact the scattered houses and tell them that the Makers have returned. Jake thought about Earth and about Colonel Hayes and about all the changes that were coming, and he felt both excited and terrified. What happens now? He asked. Now, Lady Amber said, we wake the galaxy. Lady Amber moved through Skyhold with purpose, and Jake followed her into the communication chamber, where ancient technology hummed to life at her touch. The array was massive, filling the entire room with crystalline structures that pulsed with inner light, and symbols flowed across surfaces in languages Jake could almost read. This will take time, she said, and her fingers danced across controls that responded to her presence. And we must be careful, because not all who hear our call will be friendly. What do you mean? Jake asked, and he watched as holographic displays appeared showing star maps with thousands of marked points. The elven houses scattered when the Empire fell. Lady Amber explained, and some adapted to their new circumstances, while others clung to the old ways, and a few turned dark, seeking power at any cost. You mean there are evil elves, Jake said, and he felt foolish for being surprised. There are beings of all kinds who choose cruelty over compassion, the Queen replied, and my people are no exception. She worked in silence for several minutes, and then the array blazed with light and a signal burst outward faster than light toward distant stars. "It is done," Lady Amber said. "And now we wait for responses." "How long will that take?" Jake asked. "Hours for the nearest colonies," she said. "And days or weeks for the furthest?" Jake sat down on a bench carved from the stone, and exhaustion washed over him because the last few days had been more intense than his entire life before. Lady Amber noticed, and her expression softened. "You have done well, Jake Miller," she said, "and you have given me and my dragons a future we thought lost. I just fixed your ship." Jake protested. "You did far more than that," the Queen said. "And you believed when others would have walked away, and you fought when others would have surrendered." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks, and he looked away. "What happens to Earth now?" he asked, because that was what worried him most. "Change," Lady Amber said, "and whether that change is peaceful or violent depends on choices not yet made." "Will you help us?" Jake asked. "That is why I am here," the Queen replied, "and the Makers always protected their children." Her expression grew thoughtful, and she sat beside Jake on the bench. "Tell me about your world," she said, "and I want to know how humanity has grown in my absence." Jake talked for a long time about Earth and its struggles and triumphs, and Lady Amber listened with attention that made him feel important. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled. "Your people remind me of us when we were young," she said, "and full of passion and mistakes and potential." "Is that good or bad?" Jake asked. "Both," the Queen said, "and that is what makes it beautiful." A chime rang through the chamber, and Lady Amber stood quickly and moved to the array. "Someone is responding," she said, and her voice held excitement. "Who?" Jake asked. "House Moonwhisper. One of the noble families that fled to the Outer Rim," Lady Amber said. "And they survived." The holographic display showed a face that appeared female, with features similar to Lady Amber's but with silver hair and violet eyes. "My queen," the face said, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "And we thought you lost." "Lady Celeste." Moonwhisper. Lady Amber replied with warmth, "And I thought the same of you." The two spoke rapidly in a language that Jake did not understand, but the emotion was clear, and after several minutes, Lady Amber switched back to English. "This is Jake Miller," she said. "And he is a maker who woke me from stasis." Lady Celeste stared at Jake with wide eyes. "A human," she said, "and a maker. The blood survived," Lady Amber confirmed, "and stronger than we dared hope." "What does this mean?" Lady Celeste asked, and her voice shook. "It means the prophecy was true," Lady Amber said, "and the Makers would return to reclaim their place among the stars." Over the next few hours, more responses came in, and Jake watched as Lady Amber reconnected with scattered remnants of her people, and some were joyful and some were suspicious, and a few were openly hostile. One response in particular made Lady Amber tense, and her hand moved to where a sword would hang, though she wore no weapon. "Lord Cale Darkstar," she said, and her voice was cold. The face that appeared was male with sharp features and eyes like black ice. "So the Dragon Queen finally wakes," he said with mockery in his tone, "and how convenient that she finds a pet human to legitimize her claim." "Jake is no pet," Lady Amber said, "and he carries the Makers, gift pure and undiluted." "Impossible," Lord Cale said, "and you spin tales to gather support." "Then come and see for yourself," the Queen challenged, "and let the gift speak for itself." Lord Cale smiled, and it was not pleasant. "Perhaps I will," he said, "and we have much to discuss, my queen." The connection ended, and Jake saw worry in Lady Amber's face. "He is dangerous," she said, "and he leads one of the dark houses that turned to forbidden practices after the fall." "What kind of practices?" Jake asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know. "They seek to create artificial Makers," Lady Amber said, "and to steal the gift through dark rituals, and if they learn about you, they will try to take you." Jake felt cold fear in his stomach. "What do we do?" he asked. "We prepare," the Queen said, "and we must return to Earth and secure sanctuary before Lord Cale can strike." They left Skyhold with the dragons and flew back toward the desert, and Jake rode with Lady Amber on Sundancer, and the bond between them hummed with strength as they approached the crater. Jake saw that the military presence had grown, and now there were tanks and missile launchers surrounding the ship. Lady Amber cursed in her native language. They fear what they do not understand. She said, "Can we get past them?" Jake asked. "The dragons can," Lady Amber said, "but it will require a show of force." Jake thought about Colonel Hayes and about the soldiers just doing their jobs. "Let me talk to them first," Jake said. Lady Amber looked at him with surprise. "You would negotiate?" she asked. "Violence should be the last option," Jake said, "and not the first." The Queen studied him for a long moment and then nodded. "Very well," she said, "and you remind me why I always loved the Makers." They landed at the crater edge away from the military positions, and Jake climbed down and walked toward the perimeter alone. Colonel Hayes met him halfway and his face was hard. "You disappeared, Miller," he said, "and we almost bombed that ship thinking it had taken you hostage." "It didn't take me," Jake said, "and I went to help Lady Amber." The colonel stared at him. "The alien is real," he said flatly. "Very real," Jake confirmed, "and she wants to talk." The colonel looked past Jake to where Lady Amber stood with her 7 dragons. "What does she want?" he asked. "The same thing everyone wants," Jake said, "and to find her place in the universe and protect her people." "Are we her people?" the colonel asked. "Humanity is descended from her people," Jake said, "and we are family separated by time and distance." The colonel laughed, but it was uncertain. "That is one hell of a claim, Miller." He said, "It's the truth," Jake replied, "and Lady Amber can prove it." "How?" the colonel asked. "Let her access human genetic databases," Jake said, "and she can show you the markers we share." The colonel was quiet, and then he pulled out his radio. "This is above my pay grade," he said, "and I need to make some calls." Jake waited while the colonel spoke to people far away, and Lady Amber waited with her dragons, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. Finally, the colonel returned. "My superiors want to meet with the alien," he said, "and on neutral ground with security protocols." Lady Amber approached slowly and spoke directly to the colonel. "I agree to your terms," she said, but know that I come in peace, and I expect the same courtesy." The colonel nodded, and Jake saw him trying to maintain composure in the face of something beyond his experience. "Tomorrow," then the colonel said, "and we will arrange a meeting." Lady Amber agreed, and the dragons took flight, returning to Skyhold, and Jake rode with them. And as they flew, he thought about the future. Humanity was about to learn it was not alone, and that its ancestors walked among the stars, and that dragons were real and ancient queens slept in crystal. Some would celebrate, and some would fear, and some would try to profit. And Jake knew that the easy part was over. The real work of bringing 2 peoples together across 3,000 years of separation was just beginning. But as he looked at Lady Amber and felt Sundancer's presence in his mind and saw the beauty of Earth spreading below them, Jake felt hope. Because if a salvage hunter could wake a sleeping queen and bond with a dragon, then anything was possible. And maybe, just maybe, humanity and the elven houses could build something better together than either could alone. That night at Skyhold, Lady Amber called Jake to the highest tower, and they stood together looking at the stars. "Thank you," she said, "and for believing when no one else would." "I didn't do much," Jake protested. "You did everything the Queen said, and you gave me hope when I had none." They stood in comfortable silence, and then Lady Amber spoke again. "Tomorrow, we change the world," she said, "and are you ready?" "No," Jake admitted, but I will be there anyway." She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her sound truly happy. "That is the most Maker thing I have ever heard," she said. Jake smiled and looked up at the stars and wondered which ones held elven colonies and which ones would soon hear the news that the Dragon Queen had returned. The galaxy was about to get very interesting, and Jake Miller, former salvage hunter, now dragon rider, was going to be right in the middle of it. And somehow, that felt exactly right.